Hi Pushkar, how are you? Hi Nian. Hi Shreyas.
Hi Pushkar, hi Sandeep.
Hi
Okay.
guys.
Hey, great to have everybody here. Pushkar, we're live on LinkedIn, right?
Yes, we are live.
Great. Thanks for taking the time out on a maybe busy Thursday evening, but on the bright side, you can wait for the traffic to get better if you're in Bangalore, right? So, a short intro. I think this is a little bit of a different scenario from what me and Pushkar are used to because we kind of get on live and then talk to each other and ask seemingly smart questions to one another. But Pushkar is a serial entrepreneur. He helps founders raise capital, structure capital, and also give them the thought through in terms of how they should look at institutional fundraising. He represents Temis Capital. I represent a firm called Inkex that focuses on growth GTM, predominantly for seed to Series B companies. And today we have two wonderful gentlemen who I've known for a while. One because of professional pursuits and one because of football activities. Niyant, great to have you here. Niyant is the founder and CEO of a company called Fernway. He's been involved in the Indian ecosystem for a long time, specifically focused on helping companies go cross-border and help them set up in the US and scale up and ensure that they're all compliant. Shreyas works with Niyant at Formway. Me and Shreyas play a lot of soccer together, so we kind of understand the Bangalore traffic. Nice to have you here, Shreyas. So at the start off, Niyant, why don't you just give us a little context in terms of your journey? Because we obviously have a lot of entrepreneurs here, and entrepreneurs love to hear other entrepreneurs' journey. So maybe you can give us a little bit of a flavor in terms of who you are, where you come from, and what Fernway does. Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for inviting us, Sandeep and Pushkar. Really appreciate you guys having us on here. My own personal journey mirrors our organization and the clients that we work with. Been very global in my journey overall. I was born and raised in the Middle East in Kuwait, spent some time in Dubai, moved to the US for the majority of my education, got my CPA license, started off my career with the Big Four over there. At some stage, decided to go to Canada, lived in Canada for some time, came back to the US, wanted to spend some time in Europe, worked with a lot of European businesses at the time, and then moved back to the US and made California the home. Spent most of my career with the Big Four, largely with Deloitte, a little bit of time with KPMG. At some point, just enjoyed the mid-market, early growth stage space, working with tech companies and startups. Used to do a lot of business with Canadian US companies, shifted those gears to European US businesses. In the last decade and a half, the focus for myself and our business has been largely in the India, US, Asia, US corridor. We're quite agnostic, industry agnostic as a firm, but just given the flavor of the kind of audience that we work with, in particular in the Bangalore ecosystem, but other markets of India as well, tech, SaaS, AI tends to be a key focus for us. So largely working with founders, tech companies in the Indian geography that are looking to expand into the US or build their operations in the US or scale up in the US, and just really enjoy their tenure, right? Just hearing their product strategy initially, understanding their pain points of wanting to get into the US, what their objectives are in the US, and help them navigate the waters to where they want to get to in 3, 5, 7 years. Some of our success story clients have gone off to become public companies. Others are scaling up pretty rapidly. But there's a whole host of issues and questions that come up in that journey that we've really enjoyed being a part of over the years.
Great. That's wonderful to know. I see the atlas and map behind Pushkar, and you seem to have put a lot of flags right there. I think it's actually we're at a very pivotal time period right now where there's been a lull in the ecosystem. But that being said, good companies are getting funded, and still US is the thrust market where people kind of register in the US or start off thinking that they want to sell in the US, right? So, Niyant, if you can just spare 20, 30 seconds to give us an idea of to why founders should look at the US and how should they go about the US incorporation and why the company has to be domiciled in the US, I think that will be pretty good.
Sure, absolutely. And you're right, Sandeep. This is a very interesting time that we're in. Certainly not the easiest market from an economy standpoint. Raising capital is certainly not easy. Seeing traction with end customers, in particular in the B2B space or enterprise customers, also takes a lot of sales time. The sales cycles are a lot more prolonged. That being said, we are seeing a lot of innovation come up, in particular in the India ecosystem. That's something that's very much thriving. And a lot of those businesses, in particular in the tech, SaaS, AI, in particular in the B2B context, are still heavily focused, along with the investors that are backing these businesses, still heavily focused on the US market. And that's a key point to make, because I think there's a lot of initiative right now and great innovation that's coming up in India for building in India for India. But also, I think there's enough of a recognition that the US is still a very prominent market in terms of access to capital markets, the very expansive customer base, the ability to do business easily, the center of innovation that the US is. India's got incredible talent, but US also has some great talent from a hiring growth standpoint, and just access to global markets. So from those perspectives, in particular, if you're in the tech corridor, I don't see the US as being the market that can ever be ignored for quite some time. Irrespective of what the structure and focus of the business and investors might be, the US will always be instrumental from that perspective. The second part of your question about setting up in the US is really to help create a foundation for all of those bullets that I mentioned, that until you really create a face for the business in the US, it's difficult to position yourself as a US business that is committed to the US market. And so from a customer engagement standpoint, from a employment retention standpoint, talent retention standpoint, raising capital, you really want to position yourself as a US business and set up a company in the US. So that's really the landmark first step to achieving those potential benefits in the US.
Got it. Pushkar?
Awesome. Just to point out, guys, please feel free to ask questions. Whatever questions you put in the comments, we'll see it over there, and then we can take them one by one. So Niyant, you talked about the biggest advantages of setting up a company in US. Now, as an Indian founder, there's a lot of lack of knowledge. We don't know how to go to the US or what's the right structure. We always keep hearing these terms called C Corp, S Corp, like YC uses C Corp. So what would you advise? First of all, what's the right structure? Why is it more efficient? What are the pros and cons? Something on that?
Sure. That's a very loaded question, because it's certainly not a one-size-fits-all. There tends to be a lot of information. The Google answer often tends to be set up a Delaware C Corp. A lot of investors and advisors also just lean businesses towards a Delaware C Corporation. It's a good structure, and perhaps a structure that works for many businesses, but certainly not for all. So highly recommend that founders and businesses understand what they're incorporating and why before proceeding, just so they're aware of the pitfalls that they could potentially run into in the future. There's a few different entity types that can be pursued in the US, similar to other jurisdictions. We have C corporations, we have S corporations, we have LLCs, limited liability companies. There's also an ability to set up a branch operation or a sole proprietorship. I'll eliminate kind of the context in each one of those. Some of those are highly inefficient, or from an operational perspective, or tax structure perspective, or compliance perspective, or the laws don't permit any kind of foreign ownership. So to the extent you're setting up an entity in the US where the founders are located perhaps in India, S corporation structure is generally not permissible. Limited liability company structures are permissible and could potentially work in certain scenarios, but not necessarily the most efficient from a structuring, exit planning, and potentially from a tax and compliance perspective. So that kind of brings us back to the C corporation route, which really is the default for most businesses in the US that have foreign ownership. But highly recommend that advisors that are working with companies, and also the founders themselves, understand the nuances between these entity types. Does a branch make sense for me initially when I want to keep operations in the US a little bit light, perhaps keep compliance a little bit light, and at some point pivot to C corporation models? That's not always the right answer, but sometimes contemplated. So there's nuances in each of those. Just depends on the specific roadmap of where the business is and what their specific activity plans are in the US. In terms of the state of incorporation, again, there's a little bit of a misadvice that floats around that Delaware somehow magically helps you evade taxes, which is absolutely untrue. The state of Delaware is the oldest state law in the US. So in matters of litigation, in matters of corporate restructurings, there's a lot more case law and precedent to rely upon. So a lot of attorneys generally have a preference for Delaware from that perspective. There's certainly legal benefits to setting up in Delaware in terms of it being from a statutory and limited liability protection standpoint and IP protection standpoint being a very strong jurisdiction, but you can also potentially achieve that in other state of incorporations as well. The other aspect with Delaware is if you're raising capital, in particular if you're raising capital through the US entity, most investors have a comfort with a Delaware C corporation. And so on their term sheet, they're going to push that agenda across often. Is that the right structure for every business? Perhaps not. Is it the best structure for a business that is setting up the US entity as a subsidiary of the Indian company? Perhaps not. And so just aspects to consider as you're proceeding with that structure.
Got it. But I was just wondering, why do investors prefer C Corp then? Why is there such a strong preference towards C Corp?
It's one of those aspects where it's a combination of the recommendations that come from advisors, largely from attorneys in terms of some of the legal benefits that we just touched on. And the second is just familiarity, right? Just once these structures get done over and over and over, there's a comfort level that, hey, this has worked in the past. And so perhaps is the best structure going forward. And for about 9 out of 10 clients that we work with, we generally go with the Delaware C Corp. But there are cases where a Delaware C Corp may not be the perfect solution for every business.
Got it.
Wow. Well, that's great. So there's one thing that you touched about, Nian, that I think I've heard that in the last couple of years, which is IP and how do you hold IP, right? For example, it might not be so much applicable in the case of, say, plain vanilla SaaS, but in some other industries, IP is a big part of it. Or you might have developed software in India that is held in an Indian company. You have investors in the Indian company, but the eventual objective is to go and sell in the US. So there is obviously two sides to it, right? One is valuing the IP, which basically ensures that you are in compliance with the Indian government, and then in the US, or maybe, I mean, I've seen situations in Singapore as well, but how do you effectively hold that IP in that company that you set up? And then you obviously have to do some sort of a structure with investors in India, get holding in an international entity. You could be in Singapore, could be in the US. So how do you advise entrepreneurs in this kind of a situation who are focused on some amount of IP? They might be not deep tech, but they still have some amount of IP and development that's already been done.
Yeah, and I would actually argue, Sandeep, that the relevance of IP, whether it's from a legal, tax, structuring, commercial standpoint, is relevant to almost every tech company. I think there's certain other businesses, certain other sectors where it may not be as relevant, but it's certainly in the technology spectrum for a variety of legal, tax, structuring, exit planning reasons, commercial reasons. Your IP positioning is very, very critical. The conversation and the context of that conversation that we generally have with founders and businesses really depends on where they're at in their journey. So for instance, if we're talking to an early stage founder, a lot of that just boils down to founder conviction, right? To what extent do they have a crystal ball as to their own future? What is their product? Which jurisdiction is it best designed for? Where am I likely going to seek investor capital interest? Where are my customers going to be located? Is the US, the significant market for me? Every founder likes to say, hey, I've got a global product, but what does that really mean in terms of your go-to-market strategy and just from a longevity planning perspective? Also thinking about where is exit going to take place and what will that exit likely look like? Every founder wants to become $1 billion company and list in the US, but that may or may not be the reality for every business. In particular, given certain economic conditions and the current environment certainly alludes to a little bit of that. So just understanding the product roadmap, understanding your own strengths as a business. Where do you intend to hire? Where do you intend to build your sales teams? Where are your customers located? What your focus might be initially as a business. You might see some initial traction in India, but if the eventual goal is that we're going to be largely a B2B focused on US enterprise customers or US mid-market customers, then perhaps that's the right jurisdiction to position intellectual property from day one. Where things get very difficult in terms of our discussions with advisors is any kind of a flip. And by flip, we mean keeping intellectual property initially in one jurisdiction. Say, for instance, the Indian entity holds the initial intellectual property. That's where development takes place. And then at some point down the road, deciding, hey, we're fully committed to the US market. We want to be a US business. We want intellectual property to move to the US. we'd like to eventually have our exit in the US, holdco in the US, raise capital in the US. That can certainly be done. If you're about 3 months in, 6 months in, maybe 1 year into the business, the pain points and struggles and challenges that come with that are to a certain magnitude. If you're, say, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years into the business, it's a whole host of additional complexities that come up. For instance, whenever you do any kind of a flip, there's typically, at least at minimum, some sort of a tax leakage because you're outbounding your intellectual property from one jurisdiction to another. So that jurisdiction, in this case would be India, would want to tax that transaction. And so if there's no liquidity event that's happening as part of that restructuring, how do you fund that transfer of IP? And that becomes a significant roadblock for a lot of businesses. And just boils down to, again, the similar point I mentioned earlier about founder conviction. Having that clarity as to not just where my business is today, but we're envisioning going 3 years, 5 years, 10 years down, and ideally structuring the business from that perspective.
Got it. We're also getting a lot of questions. I just want to ask a very basic question because Rohit wants to know, how do you start? A lot of Indian founders, especially who have raised some kind of capital, let's say not $10 million, but maybe pre-Series A or Series A capital, and they might be evaluating US as a market, both for moving the company and also for the, like you said, you can't ignore the US, it's the biggest market. So how do you start? Like, if you can just simplify it for them, like 2, 3, 4 things they should do.
Yeah, I think that there's a few different things that are important. Number one, just we always talk to clients about just understanding your product, right? If your product initially saw some traction in India, is it also built and ready to go to the US? Or is there certain customizations, curations that are needed for the US market? So understanding your product and the market that you're looking to target is very, very relevant. The second aspect is, what is your go-to-market strategy, right? Your founders are based in India. Do you intend to relocate to the US? Do you intend to build sales teams in the US? Do you intend to just try and drive sales remotely from India? Either of those paths could be effective for an early stage business, and certainly many businesses will try different routes or a combination of thereof. But what's the right strategy for your business in terms of the kind of product that you're selling and the kind of customers that you're engaging with? If you're in the B2C space, or you're targeting mid-market customers, or you're targeting enterprise customers, very different sales cycles. If you're targeting a sector that relies heavily on trust and confidence in the work product, then you being physically on the ground, demonstrating to the business that you're a US business, you understand their pain points, the product is customized for them, generally becomes more of a relevant consideration for those companies. And then once there's clarity in those aspects, obviously getting investor backing, not just in terms of the overall strategy, but also from a timing perspective, getting into any jurisdiction, not just the US, is a commitment from a cost, resource, funding, just from a business bandwidth standpoint, from a founder and business bandwidth standpoint, and then ensuring that you're working with the right advisors on aspects like setting up the US company, the right structure. Should it be a US parent? Should it be a US sub? Where will we raise capital in the future? What does this mean for the existing investors that have already pumped money into perhaps the Indian company? Would there need to be some sort of a restructuring? Would there need to be some sort of a flip? So all of these considerations certainly come up in the context of those initial discussions.
Wow, it's quite a big decision, I must say. It's not easy.
Absolutely, and I think a lot of this boils down to just the stage those businesses are at. For early stage companies that perhaps haven't raised a tremendous amount of capital, depending on where they're at in terms of their product development, intellectual property positioning, what value the business is today, what kind of customer traction they've seen, what kind of revenues they've seen. Doing some of these flips may not be as significant of an exercise, still entails a lot of issues, but once you see traction in those areas, even as early as you've been a 1-year business, we've seen challenges come up from a regulatory perspective, tax perspective, operational perspective. Sometimes the cost of doing these flips, the longer you wait, outweighs the benefits that the business could see. And so just having these discussions early on with advisors, even if you're initially wanting to just test the waters with your product market, but at least being aware of what it means to do a flip in the future, potentially for my business, I think is a good direction for founders to think about.
Got it. So one thing I'm actually keen to understand, Niyant, is that if you look at past 2014, 15, it's pretty much become a norm, especially in the Bay Area or New York, that if you're a VC and if you're putting money into a company, they need to have an India strategy. So they need to have an India development engineering strategy, right? So typically, what companies do is have a structure in the US where they've raised capital, but they have a development center or an engineering center here, right? And so how has that evolved in the last 7 8 years? Because I see a lot of models. I see people hiring workers remotely. There are YC companies that help you do that. There are people who do like small ODCs. So how does that work from a legal and a structure standpoint? So here we are talking about starting from the US
Right.
institutional capital to operationalizing some of the engineering and product.
Yeah, and a lot of this boils down to a lot of the considerations we discussed earlier, just having that clarity up front about what that roadmap might look like for the business. Whether you're a US business and you're trying to build an operation in India, whether it's for India or development in India or whatever that framework might look like, but also understanding how you intend to go about that process. One benefit that founders, one strategic tactical benefit that founders in India have is that they've got the boots on the ground to build that India operation. They've either been a part of the ecosystem. They know how to go about building an India operation. Typically, if you're in the US, building that ecosystem, building that structure in India can be a challenge. From a structural, legal, tax perspective, a lot of the same questions come up, right? What is our business? What is our product roadmap? What jurisdiction are we targeting? Where do we envision the business going 3, 5, 7 years from now? What do we envision the liquidity event to look like? Should the US company be the parent company, or should the US company be the subsidiary, in the context of what we're seeing for this business? The key considerations that come up in that context is that the thought process is that we'll continue raising capital in the US, we'll continue seeing the business grow in the US from a customer acquisition standpoint and being the primary consumer base. We like to position our brand and our product largely as a US business and potentially as a global business. Those are some of the key considerations to what, and also from a hiring perspective, positioning yourself as a US business. Some of the key considerations to considering keeping the US company as the parent company from a structuring perspective, and potentially also having intellectual property continue to reside in the US. One aspect that sometimes doesn't get considered by founders that initially start up in India, at a later stage want to set up also in the US, and for a variety of reasons, maybe they're a bit late in the process and they're unable to do a flip for a variety of tax, regulatory, costing reasons, and they decide to go with the structure of India parent, US sub. It sort of defines the trajectory of the business from a liquidity event standpoint, in terms of what that liquidity event might look like, where the liquidity event would likely take place. For instance, some buyers in the US may not want to do a transaction with an Indian company for a variety of structuring and tax reasons. Another aspect to consider is when you have a US subsidiary, in particular in the SaaS context and potentially in the AI context. Don't want to get too technical on this discussion, but any transfers of license fees that take place between the US company and the Indian entity for rights that are being provided to the US company to sell the product in the US could potentially see a withholding tax in the US. And that's a significant cost because of the business as a whole is a loss company, which a lot of SaaS and AI companies initially run losses. Then it's a cash out for the business. It's a net cash out for the business, which independent of what the tenure might look like in the future, it's an additional incremental cost and a burn from a cash flow perspective. So that's another reason why a lot of SaaS companies historically, in addition to a variety of the reasons, why SaaS companies initially have always set up the US company as the parent entity and intellectual property in the US versus having in a subsidiary in the US that it might have to pay this license fee to an Indian parent company and incur this withholding tax cost.
Okay. Wow. Actually, on the similar lines, I have another question. Niyant, if you remember, about 3 years, slightly more than 3 years back, we were looking at writing a couple of articles for Fernway, and that's when I realized, wow, the tax laws in the US are so complicated, man. It's like got so many states and state tax, federal tax, etc. So my question is specifically in the direction of D2C, and especially with Amazon FBA, and you have launch pads where you do cross-border transactions, and you have cross-border transactions of low ticket items, right? I'm not talking about a SaaS $1,000 billing, but a lower ticket item. How do you help companies who do that, who have significant revenue in the US or who are building up to significant revenue in the US, though they are not domiciled in the US as yet? Right? So they have product, it's commodity, they're using platforms, but they're selling, but there's a whole lot of tax, legal sort of, I mean, I'm thinking of way too many words, but there's too much stuff out there, right?
Right. No, absolutely. And a lot of considerations come up in that context because for a variety of reasons that you touched on, they may not be at the junction yet, or they may not even be at the junction in the future to want to set up a US entity, or may not want to set up a US entity with significant operations. They may have, for a variety of operational reasons, such as in the B2C context and in the consumer product context, wanting to optimize for foreign exchange transfers, for instance. There's often a preference to have transactions go directly through the Indian company. Also optimizes for cash flow. In that scenario, there's no need to keep additional cash reserves in the US company. The challenge you run into is you put the business, the Indian entity specifically, in a scenario where the Indian entity now has to comply with various regulatory requirements in the US. For instance, in the context of income tax or sales tax, because the company is selling directly in the US, does the Indian company have an obligation to file tax returns in the US, either from an income tax perspective, certainly from a sales tax perspective, if it's selling directly to, if it's in the e-commerce scenario, selling directly to end customers in the US, there typically would be a sales tax implication, which effectively means the Indian entity would have to register to do business in various states, collect sales tax from the end customers, and then remit it to the tax authorities. So more of a cash in, cash out for the company, but more compliance. So when you run that compliance through a non-US business, administratively, just a little bit more complicated and convoluted to execute. There are platforms that do enable some level of optimization there. For instance, if you're selling through Amazon, Amazon takes on what's called a marketplace facilitator role, which does endeavor to streamline some of those components, but not 100%. So just something for businesses to be mindful of. And otherwise, the making founders aware of what that means for their business, what are the pros and cons of running those transactions through the US company versus having going directly through the Indian business.
Got it. Yeah, because I asked you that question because it can get very tricky, right? For example, if you're selling a commodity and all of a sudden you're selling it through Amazon and 2 other platforms, and you're selling to customers in 50 different states and they have different tax regulation, that's going to be a big nightmare. And
yes, and the US is a little bit different in that regard to a few other jurisdictions such as India. For instance, we have sales tax, which is somewhat similar to the GST context in India, but it's different from the standpoint that sales tax is determined based on where the end user is located. So if physical products being shipped out, the location of where those products are being shipped to, in the SaaS context, where the benefit of use of that license is taking place. So if the end user is located in state X, it's that state's sales tax rules that would drive taxability in that context. There's also additional layers of city taxes that come in. For instance, certain products might be taxable in the SaaS context. Certain products might be taxable at the city level, but may not be taxable at the state level. There's also often a misconception that a lot of businesses have that if you're selling into the US from an Indian company, we don't have to comply with US laws. And that's a huge misconception. There are certain thresholds that could be applicable in certain instances where certain states may have regulations to say that if the level of activity falls below a certain threshold of number of transactions or dollar amount of transactions, you may not have a compliance obligation. But stating that we're just going to sell to an Indian company and not deal with compliance in the US is a misunderstanding.
got it. Pushkar?
I was just wondering because Praveen had 2 questions. Now he's asking, can you sell technology from India to US? Of course you can. And now, as you talked about, setting up a US entity is not very easy. Like it has certain intricacies. There is a cost involved to it. Now, when do you think, in your opinion, is the right time for an Indian founder to say, hey, now my dollar volumes in US have reached this X amount, let's say $10,000 or $100,000, and now the costs can justify setting up a US entity? Because you
Right.
can't, there's no point doing it if you're only selling what, like $5,000 a month, right?
Right.
It has
Right.
to be a certain level.
We typically see that as a question which has a few different, it's an intersection of a few different considerations in no particular order. One consideration would be just understanding the product, right? Is my product ready for the US market? And being very true to yourself, you've seen traction in one jurisdiction, but is it ready from a sophistication, from a curation, from a customization standpoint for the US market? Once you sort of check off that box, or you've got comfort in that box in terms of the product roadmap, understanding the sales traction that you're seeing. Sales traction depending on the specific product that you're selling and to what extent. So say, for instance, in today's environment, if you're selling largely B2B products to, say, enterprise customers, do you typically want to see some level of traction, at least NDAs with enterprise companies, and some level of intention to sign contracts before jumping ahead and taking a call as to whether should we commit to the US market? Some businesses will just start to run some sales through the Indian business, as you mentioned, maybe 50K, 100K, 200K. There are compliance issues that come up in that context, but most finders would at least want to see some traction that, hey, we can at least see dividends of this product getting shipped out to the US. The third aspect is founders thinking about their go-to-market strategy in the US, right? Not just in terms of initial sales, but how do we scale up operations in the US? Are we going to build up a sales team? Would one of the founders potentially relocate to the US? Would there be a lot of back and forth? Are we positioning ourselves as an Indian business that's selling in the US initially and eventually trying to become a US business? Understanding that roadmap and the strategy around that and timing that with the intersection of the product considerations and the sales cycles is also a relevant area to think about. And then the last, but also very critical, is investor backing, right? You want to ensure the investors are not just comfortable with the company going to the US market, but also the timing of that decision. Once there's clarity around the timing of those areas, we generally get into a conversation with our clients to say, hey, now's a good junction for you to start thinking about setting up in the US. And if there's clarity around what that might look like 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 7 years from now, from a growth, customer acquisition, fundraise, hiring perspective, we can better advise the business on what's the right structure for them to enter the US market.
Got it.
Pushkar, do you want to take some more questions?
I think we can take, so there is an interesting question from Hari. Let's take that. Can offshore entities registered in Delaware operate in the US market, directly sell to customers in different states? Because in India, most founders realize US also has very stringent state laws, right? Every state is different. So
yeah, absolutely. So one clarification that I'll mention is that there's generally 2 layers of taxation at a very high level, keeping it simple. There's 2 layers of taxation that apply in the US. The first layer is federal taxation, which is every business in the US is subject to a 21% corporate income tax. And then those same profits are then subject to an additional layer of state taxes in the state or states in which the company has presence. I wanted to mention that upfront in the context of the question that's being raised, because just because the business is incorporated in the state of Delaware, that on its own does not independently drive the state or states in which the company is subject to state tax. Also, it doesn't drive the ability, the extent to which the company has the ability to transact in various states. So for instance, if the company is incorporated in the state of Delaware, it can absolutely sell products into other states. Prior to doing that, it would have to register to do business in those states. There's various rules that could kick in. Some states, most states do not have any dollar threshold. Most states will indicate if you are transacting in the state, you're deriving economic benefit from the state, you're selling to customers in the state, the company needs to be registered to do business in that state, which in the B2B context, in particular, even the B2C context for that matter, for a lot of e-commerce, SaaS businesses, often eventually that means you're registering in 20, 30, 40, 50 states in the US, and that's not an uncommon direction for businesses to go. So from a compliance perspective, that's a statutory requirement for the businesses to take on. Once that requirement has been met, the company has an ability to sell to customers in those states, take advantage of the legal system in that state, and conduct operations in that state from a hiring and customer acquisition standpoint.
Got it. I think it's a bit like GST in India, right? Because whichever state you want to do business in, you must have a local GST license. I think so, or something of that sort.
Along those lines, there are a few nuances because the state tax context in the US, as I mentioned, is driven by the state or states in which the company has presence. Unfortunately, for some businesses, that's driven by presence is determined by where you have employees, where you have offices, but also where you have customers. Mm-hmm. So the e-commerce context and the SaaS context, for a lot of businesses, that means you're registering to business in 20, 30, 40, 50 states pretty rapidly as the businesses scale up. And that's a good problem for businesses to have, but it's a critical area for founders to be aware of. I think it's also important for our audience to hopefully be aware of this consideration, because I won't take names, but there's a lot of businesses, very large businesses that are also in the public domain, that have recently been issued notices to say that because they haven't been compliant with state-specific regulations, they've actually received seizure notices from the state authorities that they're no longer able to conduct business in those states. And that usually means an inability to engage with customers, and an inability to engage with vendors and employees, and do any kind of transactions in that state. So from a compliance perspective, it's a very critical area to be mindful
of. Got it.
So Niyat, I have a question regarding your customer segments. I know you've worked with unicorns like Freshworks. What is your sort of sweet spot, or rather, where does most of your business come from? Like 60, 70%, if you were to categorize it in terms of stages of businesses, funded, unfunded, and I know you work with a lot of funds as well. So if you can give us a little bit of flavor on that, I think that would be great.
Yeah, we're very agnostic as a business in terms of the kind of businesses we work with, the geographies that these businesses are located in. That being said, majority of our client base, about 99% of our client base, are foreign businesses expanding into the US, or US companies expanding internationally. So the cross-border context, the international structuring, tax, compliance context very much aligns with the focus of the business. In terms of the sectors that we work with, it's 65%, if not 70%, predominantly tech-focused. So tech, SaaS, AI, biotech, fintech, other forms of tech businesses, software companies. That tends to be the larger focus, just by the spectrum of the businesses that we've come across. We have other clients in other sectors as well. In terms of the life cycle of these businesses, majority of our client base falls in the VC-backed category. So they're typically investor-backed. Some of them are very early stage businesses, so we get in right at the time of incorporation. We help scale up the business. We help with the right structure. So pre-revenue companies scaling up. So I'd say majority of them fall in the early growth stage cycle. And then we have an intent to partnership model, which is that we like to scale up with these businesses. As they grow, we grow with them. We also try to curate our recommendations for them. One thing I tell all our clients is that, as an advisor, we have 50 things that we can dump onto a business. That being said, sure, we understand from a resource standpoint, every business, founder, finance team has only a certain amount of a bandwidth. And so we try to, based on our experience working with a lot of tech, SaaS, AI companies, in particular in the India-US context, try to focus on the 3, 5, 7 things that are most critical for them, specific to the stage they're at. So if you're just setting up your operations, what are the things to be mindful of? If you're 6 months in, 1 year in, 5 years in, now you've raised some capital, what are the things to be thinking about? You've got to Series A, what are things to be thinking about? There's further rounds of fundraise, more due diligence is happening. What are some of the key considerations that come up? So we try to phase those recommendations in as the business scales up.
Got it. So you get in quite early, ideally at seed or just before seed, and typically want to stay through the direction as they grow, because the complexities are not going to go away, unfortunately.
100%. I mean, it's also not uncommon for us to get involved in businesses right at the time of inception. And that's something we highly encourage and enjoy, because we've had an opportunity to really understand the product roadmap, understand the founder vision right from the get-go, and hopefully impart some understanding of issues to be mindful of they may be a pre-revenue company. They may not even have any expenses in the US. They're just launching the business. But the ability to have a conversation and make the founder aware of what to be mindful of in the future from a structuring perspective, from a go-to-market strategy, from a scale standpoint, is something that we enjoy in terms of our engagement with businesses. And so we often get into the very early stage as well.
Got it. Pushkar, questions from your side, or you want to pick up more questions?
So, yeah, maybe we can pick Karthik's question because I found it quite interesting. Now, Niyat, in your experience, you must have helped, I'm sure, hundreds of companies reach out to the US. Now, he's just asking, like, in your experience, how many companies, Indian companies, you have seen who have managed to achieve PMF? I know you can't have a quantitative answer to it, but is it very difficult to achieve PMF in India? Or most startups you have seen have done it, most have struggled? Any thoughts on that?
The percentage is very high. I will mention that, at least for the client base that we work with. I think the reason for that being is because we're US focused in the context of the advice that we provide. Typically, a founder or a company will come to us when they have some level of conviction about the US market. From either from a product perspective, from a customer acquisition standpoint, or from an investor backing standpoint, there's some level of conviction that the US is the right market for us. Now, at what stage, at what speed, at what scale, how successful, that certainly varies from business to business. And what path that they take on to get to where they want to get to certainly varies from business to business. But a majority of our clients have been able to make that conversion, not just in terms of getting up and running in the US, but seeing traction and success in the US. Because ultimately, it is a massive market from a customer acquisition, the entire tech ecosystem, the B2B landscape, from a hiring perspective, raising capital perspective. It's an ideal market in many respects for a lot of tech companies. It's not the only market to thrive in, but it's a very critical and significant market. And so for a lot of at least, this session is targeting technology companies and technology founders. In that audience that we typically work with, we have seen a good amount of success in terms of the conversion and traction that those businesses have been able to achieve.
Wow, yeah, that's quite encouraging for founders, Indian founders, because people often think US is not an easy market to crack, right? It takes a lot of effort to crack the US market.
Yeah, and I think there are some statistics that say that 2025 or 2026, Indian SaaS companies are going to dominate about 10% of global SaaS revenues. I mean, these are trends that have grown exponentially. I believe over the past 5 years, ARR from Indian SaaS companies have grown 5x or 7x, and I think those trends will continue. There's a lot of focus and push right now on AI companies, and I think in the B2B context, sales cycles will certainly be a challenge for a lot of businesses. But the ones that are able to penetrate that and see success there, in particular with a strong go-to-market strategy, some boots on the ground in the US, whether it's sales initiatives, founder relocations, etc., I think we'll see a lot of traction in the US market.
Yeah, the SaaS revenue is growing quite quickly, but that being said, there's so much of competition in every different areas, right? So there's a lot of capital, unfortunately, that's going into platforms, content, all of that. But the SaaS revenues are encouraging and they're growing.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of cash that's on the sidelines. I think we're all aware of that. And I think we've seen good trends with some of that coming back in particular the early stages. A lot of tech AI companies are seeing good backing now. But how markets respond and how these companies are able to demonstrate path to profitability, I think will be a key driver in terms of how things progress from here on.
Sure. I think I had noted on another question, which I think most of you guys will find funny, but especially when it comes to an exit for an angel or could be an early institutional fund, the cap tables can get quite messy, especially India-US structure, right? So do you see a lot of those, especially when it comes to exit at multiple stages? It could be secondaries that you issue starting from a Series A all the way. I don't think that too many secondaries happen for angels at Series C, but still exits and messy cap tables, valuation discussions, all of that.
Yeah, I mean, something we see quite often. I think the distinction between companies that are able to manage it well versus those that get into playing more catch up. I think the distinction is the businesses that work with advisors, whether it's us, good legal counsel, good investors that are guiding these businesses in terms of how to structure those cap tables, how to manage those cap tables, thinking about your corporate structure. The number of business, sometimes you come across businesses that set up two separate entities as a parallel structure and try to replicate cap tables, thinking that at some stage they can consolidate into a vertical arrangement. We understand the intention there, but that on its own creates a lot of complexity, because ultimately as a business, you're developing intellectual property in one jurisdiction and you're creating value in one jurisdiction. You might be selling through another entity or a couple of different entities, but typically intellectual property gets created in one jurisdiction. So that creates some complexity in terms of where the investors are located, which entity they should be pumping cash into, where's the value, and then what does that look like in the future from a structuring and exit planning perspective. So working with good founders up front, good advisors up front, from a tax, regulatory, legal structuring perspective to ensure the structures are put out well, but also cap tables are kept clean and effective, is really the right direction for founders to take on.
I believe that also answers Yogmaya's question when she says, are there any entities that early stage startups looking to expand into the US can approach for assistance? So how do these guys reach out to you? What's the best way? Is it email, LinkedIn?
We typically get, most of our introductions come in through, word of mouth, existing founders or CFOs are referring us to, people that need assistance in the US context, or VCs or investors might reach out to us. Typically by email would be the best path.
Awesome.
And all of you can connect to both Niyant as well as Shreyas on LinkedIn. I think they are both quite active.
Yeah, we're also very heavily focused on the India-Asia market. Shreyas is heading up our US operations in India. I myself come to India quite frequently, usually every couple of months. Bangalore tends to be a big market for us, but we also spend a lot of time in Chennai, Mumbai, Pune, Bangalore, Delhi, Gurgaon, Kerala, other markets. And so very much active in the India ecosystem. And to the extent, guys are looking for advice and clarity about what it means to enter the US market, we're more than happy to do that.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I have one final question, Niyant, and this might be, again, a very subjective one, but at the start of the conversation, you spoke about you can either have an India parent and US sub or vice versa, right? Now, it also depends upon the stage of the startup, and I'm sure there are 10 different reasons or 10 different factors that decide that. But in your opinion, if you can tell us pros and cons of both approaches, hey, if you're this kind of company, you should do an India sub and US parent and vice versa. Is there a list like that or some guidelines?
Yeah, there certainly are guidelines. Definitely not a one size fits all, but the guidelines, at least the context and construct that we'd recommend companies think about is, just really doing a lot of introspection about the business. If the intention is to raise capital primarily in the US, that's where the VCs that we intend and see more success with are located, then that's the right market for the business. Also ask yourself questions about where will my customer acquisition take place? And that's a tricky and relevant question, because a lot of founders, in particular tech companies, say, oh, this is a global product. And we see traction in Europe, we see traction in the US, we see traction in India, and that's fantastic. But understanding, in terms of the product market fit and the go-to-market strategy, where do you envision seeing the initial traction, and where do you envision seeing majority of the value creation take place over time? And for a lot of tech companies, a lot of SaaS companies, AI companies, in particular in the B2B context, if the US is the right market, then that's probably the right jurisdiction for the parent company. Hiring is another aspect, although a lot of Indian companies have enough confidence with the talent that's located in India. And so, they may look to building a sales team initially in the US. And at some stage, at a much later stage, you might build up a larger operation in the US. But typically, hiring doesn't become a critical differentiator unless there's specific skills you're looking for. And the last aspect is the positioning of the company, not just from a branding perspective, but also from a contractual and legal standpoint. Specific products that are targeting specific sectors. For instance, if you're selling to the medical sector as one example, you're a SaaS company selling to the medical sector, being a US company, in terms of that's where the intellectual property is located, is a huge point of validation for these end customers. It sometimes is a requirement because product warranties can be relied upon in terms of various GDPR types initiatives. It becomes a critical consideration for these companies. That's just one aspect, but there's several sectors where the end customer base might mandate or have a strong preference for the companies that they engage with to be a US company. So those are generally the key considerations. Then obviously, just from a tax perspective, from a structuring perspective, we talked about the withholding tax considerations. That's a key component for businesses to think about. And the last piece I'll mention is the timing. If the Indian company has been in existence for say 10, 15 years already, just taking a binary scenario, at that point, contemplating a US company as a holdco and doing a flip is a much more extensive exercise. It can potentially be done, but it's a much more extensive exercise. So when you're in the initial stages of the time of setup, 3 months in, 6 months in, 1 year in, you generally have a bit more flexibility. But as time goes on with that passage of time, doing flips entails a lot more considerations prior to any shifts in the structures.
That's very, very insightful.
Right. Very good insight.
Yeah, that was a very great insight. Niyat, Pushkar, if you don't mind, I have a final question from my end. And the question is, considering the zone or stage where we kind of work with a lot of founders, which is typically at seed, pre-series A, series A. When somebody raises seed from India, could be a collection of angels or could be a micro VC. Similar is pre-series A. There could be maybe once larger VC that comes in, and then there's a collection of money. And when the company realizes that, hey, the short is in the US, I need to go all in. And I've seen this so many times over the last 4 or 5 years. There is obviously a US entity structure that's set up, or a US entity structure which is set up slightly earlier, maybe 6 months, 8 months earlier. And the VC in the US is doing due diligence, and the VC on the cap table in India wants this to get through. What are the things that the founder needs to be wary of, and what does he need to be really prepared for, right? I mean, this is kind of segueing into the checklist, which we'll be sharing with a lot of people. But I think the question is, what does he need to have mentally at least chalked out from a project management point in time when he goes to the US and he raises a ton of money for Series A, for instance?
Yeah. Fantastic question. And it's a very relevant question, in particular post-2021. And I'll add some context there. Pre-2021, when cash was perhaps floating around a bit more fluidly, you'd see investors getting into early stage businesses with less level of due diligence and scrutiny. Post-2021, a lot of the discussions with investors have suddenly become a lot more prolonged. It's also created an opportunity for investors to raise the question, hey, we'd like to understand the businesses they're investing in a little bit more before we cut that check. To what extent have you guys been compliant? To what extent are your structures in line with what operationally from a tax and legal efficiency standpoint makes sense? And where is the business at in terms of just how well organized it is? And so post-2021, we've seen a lot of focus in that area and started to work with a lot of VCs to ensure that the portfolio companies that they're investing into, but also the existing portfolio companies, are aligned and compliant and ready from this perspective. So the key considerations that we see come up at that junction of the business, and I'll maybe describe a few scenarios. There's a spectrum of things. It just depends on the specific company. Sometimes we get a comment saying that, hey, we're pre-revenue, or revenues are not so significant at this stage. Do we really need to worry about tax compliance? And that's a big misconception, because one critical aspect to consider is that in the US, there's been a strong push over a number of years, but more so in the past decade and a half, for a cross-border reporting and international governance. And so in that context, any US company that has foreign subsidiaries or foreign ownership has a variety of disclosure requirements to comply with. This is disclosure and reporting that most good advisors should hopefully be able to take on. But the number of early stage businesses that we have seen that are working with advisors that are not so familiar with these cross-border reporting requirements and are subject to non-compliance penalties And these non-compliance penalties range anywhere from $10,000 automatic penalties to $25,000 automatic penalties on a per year, per disclosure basis.
Wow.
Is quite common. And so just wanted to throw that out there, that compliance and due diligence and tax considerations are not just applicable to profitable businesses or revenue generating companies. Even prior to that, there's some critical considerations that we have run into with a number of businesses, that this is not a uncommon observation in terms of the audiences that we have interacted with in the past. For companies that are revenue generating, there's a number of areas to think about. There's there's income tax regulations in the U.S. There's sales tax regulations in the U.S. There's property tax governance requirements in the U.S. There's payroll tax requirements in the U.S. So is the company broadly, or getting the specifics, compliant with each of those areas? At least providing some level of high-level comfort to the investors that all the right filings have been done, all the right taxes have been deposited, all the right positions have been taken care of. In the tech corridor, one area that we see come up a lot is sales tax. A lot of businesses are trying to grow the product, get some traction in the US, build on sales, but often are not so mindful of sales tax. And that's an area we're seeing an immense amount of scrutiny from the tax authorities. A key consideration to keep in mind is that if you're not collecting sales tax and you're not registered for sales tax purposes in various states in the US, then the statute of limitations, meaning the time that the state tax authorities have to come and audit you, is indefinite. And so they can come at any point in the future and penalize you for that period of non-compliance. So another critical area that a lot of businesses that sometimes say, hey, we're not profitable, they should also be mindful of this aspect. The third area that I'll talk about is just the corporate structure hygiene, right? You talked about messy cap tables, Sandeep, but also thinking about the structure, where's my intellectual property located, how well have I stayed true to that structure. One other relevant area that from a structure perspective that the investor in the US is likely going to raise is a concept called QSBS, Qualified Small Business Stock. And what QSBS effectively indicates is that if various requirements of the company and shareholder level are met at the time of exit for the US US shareholders, whether it's a VC or an employee or a founder that might relocate to the US, there's significant tax benefits that can be availed at the time of exit. And so asking the question to the company, are you structured and are you optimized from a QSBS perspective, is a very, very common and critical question that any US investor would raise. So those are some of the initial questions and conversations that we would have from a due diligence readiness perspective, and others would vary just depending on the specific business and the extent of operations and structure in the US.
Wow, that's a lot of nuggets in the end.
Right.
A lot of things that I've not heard about, but I've always looked a lot of messy kata cap tables, and but this is really, really interesting, because you need to solve for them, and you need to solve for them as early as possible, and not wait till things kind of snowball in your face. That's the sort of insight, because I'm not qualified to do a lot of this stuff, but I've got co-investor buddies of mine who take care of legal due diligence, etc., etc. But US tax and compliance is not something, but that's actually very, very good, because I think all the founders who are listening in will definitely know that it's not all rosy, right? You just want to go to the US and sell, but there got to be the guardrails that you put out there for your startup, whether it is to bootstrap and scale the business, or whether it's to raise capital in different stages.
Ease of doing business is fantastic in the US, but there's certainly complexities, and there are avenues of complexity that are very different to other jurisdictions. So I go back to my earlier comment, just keeping founders and businesses aware of what is critical for them at the junction that they're at. There are certain issues that can probably be deferred out, but there's certain issues that the cost of remedy, or if it can be remedied in the future, becomes very, very significant, or could potentially become very significant. So there's certainly some areas that we do highly recommend businesses, even at the very initial stage, be mindful of prior to proceeding with growth into the US.
Great. So why don't we talk about the checklist? And Niyant, it'll be a pleasure to host you in person when you are in Bangalore sometime. I think there's a lot of founders here. We're going to definitely do a couple of mixers for sure. But Pushkar, you want to take a minute to talk about the checklist, and everybody can get access to it? What do they need to do?
Right. So Niyant and team, they have prepared a checklist for if you're interested in moving to the US. How do we do it, Sandeep? Like if everyone writes interested in the
Yeah, I
comments
think everybody writes interested or checklist.
or
Yeah, just write
whatever.
interested at the bottom of the LinkedIn live, and you would probably have to send me or Pushkar a connection request, and we'll DM you the checklist.
I think it's much better than emailing you, like it's more convenient. You
Yeah,
don't have
yeah,
to put your email addresses,
yeah,
just write.
exactly, exactly. And Niyant and Shreyas, do you want to just share your email addresses as well so that people can email you directly?
Absolutely.
Or maybe you can give a link of a website where they'll find your email address. Whatever's
Sure.
more convenient.
Pushkar, got it in the private chat if you can move it across.
Yes.
And just to provide some context on this playbook that's being distributed, there's a wealth of information, some pretty significant intellectual property that we've built over the years in terms of issues, considerations to be mindful of for any business that's expanding into the US, irrespective of the stage and size that you're at. And so, something that we happily pass on to founders or businesses that would like to learn a little bit more, in addition to what's been covered in this session.
Awesome. I think we are almost 1 minute over time.
Yep.
Any final thoughts, Sandeep, or we call it quits?
I
Anything
think
you
this
would
was a great session, right, Pushkar? I mean, I think I definitely learned a lot, considering I've been doing, sort of working with founders and investing myself for the last 5-6 years. I think I absolutely learned a lot. Thanks to both of you. I think the key takeaways for me was the fact that you really need to know what is your product and GTM roadmap before you do your structure, before you figure out how to raise capital, and what are the compliances, checks and balances that you need to have in place, right? Because that is going to chart out how you're going to scale the business and get the right capital in, right? Of course, it is not as simple as I made it sound. It's very high level, but there's definitely a lot of complexity, and fantastic to have you guys. Having experts like Fernway helping a SaaS AI tech business definitely would help the founder sleep a lot better at night. Not that the founders sleep a lot, but
No, this was a lot of fun, guys. Thanks, Sandeep and Pushkar, for having us on. And one aspect that we often feel when we talk to a lot of our clients that are located, in particular in India, is the US is often a big black box, right, for a lot of non-US folks. And so you only know what you know, and as much of knowledge share you can absorb over time, just helps you to be more ready for what the business can potentially face in the future. So we're happy to talk to founders, happy to talk to the finance teams on any questions. And it was wonderful to be a part of this conversation with you guys.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Enjoy your day.